All right, welcome everybody. It's Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. My name's Scott Maier. This is Drawing Together with Artists Network, where we meet every Wednesday to draw together. So we select a new image, a new project to work on each week so that we take time out of our lives to improve our skills. So this is what I chose for today. You can see the reference below me. It's this beautiful mountain valley with this, this wonderful kind of luminous kind of atmosphere to it. So we're going to try to work on that. I chose to work on this tan-toned paper, though, so that helps us to incorporate a little bit of color, and in particular to kind of create some variety in that way in terms of capturing that atmospheric depth. And so should be a good challenge today. It's a lot of fun. I know we've had some kind of crazy weather here in Colorado. It's nice to have the sun back, and this just reminds me of summer, and I kind of want it back right now. So again, welcome everybody. If you have any comments, questions, observations, and you want to throw them into the chat, please feel free to do so. I love to see where you're all viewing from. If you're following along using the same materials, if you're doing a similar project or something entirely different, this is all about us drawing together. So kind of do what you will with that. So I love seeing all the familiar names. I can't wait to get started. So let's take a look. Again, if you need to find the reference, it's in the description below the video. You can bring that up and you can draw along with, or as many of you have indicated, you prefer to kind of watch and then draw along later. So, but if you do draw, I want to see your work. There's a link in the description below as well as the top of the chat where you can share your work on the show page on Artists Network. So, all right, let's get to it. Hello, everybody. We've got people from Wisconsin, BC, from Germany, San Francisco, or we've got Georgia, Ohio, Chicago, everybody. This is awesome. This is the best. So, all right, the paper. Let's get started with this. So last week we worked on the gray toned paper from, it's this Soho Urban Artist Sketch kind of Kraft paper, which I really like to work on. It's a little bit lighter weight than I typically work on, but I've been really enjoying just the quality of paper. There's kind of a smoothness to it, but there's also enough tooth that it can hold a variety of materials. And I kind of like the delicacy of it. I thought it aligned well with this image. Other things that we're going to be drawing with today, I've got graphite here, a range of harder and softer. So I've got the H, the 3B, and the 12B. This is from this set here of the Cezanne pencils, which I really like. They're nice and smooth. They have kind of a bias towards the softer, darker graphite, which I prefer. So if you haven't tried them, check them out. And then for some of the light areas, I've got the Soho. These are the sketch squares right here. That's what these are right here. That is a nice soft white, but they also have this General's charcoal white pencil for some greater control. And the C erasers, I got my trusty Kneaded eraser and my Derwent retractable eraser that I have shaved down to this chisel tip to give me some precision that way. And then last but not least, my trusty blending stump and a paper towel to help wipe things down. So let's get to it. I'm excited to draw today. It feels like it's been a long week. And it feels like it's been forever since I got to draw with you all. So I'm very much looking forward to this. All right. Whew. All right, deep breath. What am I going to do to get started? So I'm going to start with the harder graphite pencil. So this is an H, which isn't. This is kind of a mid-range for what most people are kind of accustomed to. My first goal is to simply orient myself to the scene. So I'm going to do a quick gesture here to identify some of the forms. This is all fairly light, but hopefully I can draw dark enough in this stage to for it to show up here. And I'm just trying to think in terms of mass here. So lines will come into play in this drawing, but I want to start by thinking about value relationships and shapes. And that's something that we talk about a lot in this show, is that the two basic ways of thinking about a form is either linearly or as a shape, as a value shape. And I'm going to try to prioritize value shapes. And so in this gesture, I'm not really worried about any particular marks. Part of it is just loosening up, warming up I'm not actually trying to render anything. I'm just trying to kind of connect my mind, taking an initial scan over the drawing, try to account for the whole thing, try to see it as a whole. And again, it's all very light, but we'll get to the point of refinement as we go. Now, one of the things, working with this toned paper, this has a value associated with it. So I know I can go lighter in value. And right off the bat, I'm going to start to make some decisions about how I'm going to use the paper in terms of those value relationships. So I know I can go lighter in value here. You see how bright that white is. And that helps me to see the natural tone of the paper. And my first inclination is to assign the distant mountain here as essentially the basic tone. So even though I've laid some value down here, I might end up lifting that off later and then render that by working on the negative space of the sky, so lightening up that background sky. And so we'll kind of work on those together. And so we'll talk about the value, the natural value of the paper, as well as the value we can achieve by mixing the graphite and the white material together. All right, so in this first pass, you can see essentially I'm treating everything below the sky as one value, and then we'll gradually get darker. And so I'm not worried about making any of these marks permanent or precious. Again, I just want to kind of just familiarize myself with the subject. And now one of the things that becomes really dominant is that angle of that distant mountain here, that's kind of on the right side of the valley. And I'm going to try to lock that in. I think that's going to be essentially my anchor for the composition. Hello, Nell. It's good to have you back. And then Nia, sounds like you're the parakeet that we worked on last week. Looked more like a pigeon, but I don't know, close. I'm glad you enjoyed it, but that happens with drawing sometimes. It just doesn't work out. And we'll move on to the next one, or we give it a shot later. All right. So what am I doing here? I'm going to. So as I look at these mountains, I'm going to try to break them down into kind of simple shapes here. And I talked about addressing these as shapes rather than lines. But I think I'm going to backtrack on that and start to indicate some of these lines. And now one of the things that I'm going to have to be mindful of, though, is whether or not I can address those lines later. If I want to get rid of those lines, am I going to be able to do that? So as I'm to kind of protect myself in that way, I'm intentionally using the side of the pencil. So it allows the material to kind of float on the surface a little bit. If I switch to this tripod grip, there's more of a chance that I'll emboss a line on the page, and it'll be harder to lift it off later. So in terms of keeping the marks light and loose, using an overhand grip can be helpful with that. I'm also using the small thumbnail, the one that's below me on the screen in front of me, the same one that you're looking at right now. And that helps me to identify the basic shapes and looking at it through blurred vision. The other thing that I think the other decision I want to make right now at this point is to, and as I'm scanning this portion of the reference image, there's some high contrast areas where you have the light hitting that open meadow and then the cluster of trees that are a little bit darker. So you get this high contrast here. And I'm going to lift those lights back out. So what I'm going to do is, rather than start by establishing those, I'm going to block it in as a major value and then lift out the lighter values later. So right off the bat, what I'm looking to do is create a value structure that moves from darkest here in the area that's closest to us in that immediate foreground, getting a little bit lighter but still quite dark, and then moving into increasingly lighter areas back to that distant horizon. And one of the things I liked about that composition is that you see this kind of high contrast area where you have this dark ridge line here against that light sky, and then there's this kind of gentle walk around this way. We get some high contrast here that pulls us across and then back up that hillside, and then we kind of gently meander over here. So I think compositionally this is a strong photo. Again, if you're looking for the reference photo, it's in the description below, along with the photo credit for the photographer who took this. And what I like about this paper is that you can really smooth out those marks easily. So again, this is all about orienting myself and identifying the large shapes. And I do think I'm going to switch to the darker forms. The darker pencil here to indicate these forms, just so they show up a little bit. And so this is just to help as a reference. One of the things we'll talk about is my kind of process for moving from the background forward and really layering these forms. And so as I think about these ridge lines here, and I can make these subtle indications of it, but again, I want to prioritize shape over line. And you can kind of practice your stroke before you fill it in. And in this way here, you can see on the screen the relationship between the angle of my pencil and then the slope on the hillside and the reference photo. I can see the two side by side, and if they look fairly parallel, I can then drop in some of these marks to kind of capture that. And I'm going to first worry about getting the angle right and then adjust the placement. So I haven't really done any measuring to see if this is the right height yet. I'm going to prioritize, again, the angle. And then I can kind of raise that up if I need to. And again, as with drawing we do in this series, you as the artist are in control of how directly you're going to reference the image, the reference photo. If you want to use it as a starting off point and be more expressive, if you want to be 100% truthful to it and make a drawing that really looks like the photograph, again, that's kind of up to you. And I may be somewhere in between here. But it can be helpful to identify that going into a drawing is what is that tolerance? How much variation are you kind of willing to accept? All right, so I'm just kind of, as I look at this line, it can be helpful to indicate some landmarks in that foreground. Because in terms of creating that scaling, we want to refer the background mountains to the foreground mountains to line up properly. Because it's really easy to get kind of locked into one place in space, kind of render that and then move forward and lose sight of how they relate to one another. And in this case, on the page, that distant mountain and then this more foreground ridge, they're actually close together. But sometimes what can happen is when you get engaged with that reference photo, you get kind of pulled back into that space. And if you're looking back here, your awareness of what's happening in the foreground can fade away. And so by letting your eyes lose focus, try to take in the whole drawing at once at this stage, it helps you to establish those relationships early on and keep those on focus. So you're constantly comparing the background to the foreground. So Marty Lake, does your paper have a tooth? I have tinted pastel paper or smooth white. This is it's a fairly smooth surface, not a very rough surface, not quite like a pastel paper. Although one pastel paper that I know a lot of pastel artists like to work is the Canson Mitientes paper. It feels kind of smooth to the touch, but it actually holds the material well. So if that's something that you're working with, it might actually work well with it. And then Nia is asking what size is the paper. This is just a little bit smaller than the 8.5 by 11, so it's pretty close to the 8 by 10. So with the taped edge here, the opening is right about an 8 by 10, which kind of matches the scale of the reference photo. So again, if you're new, what you're watching is Drawing Together with Artist Network. We draw for a couple hours. Feel free to ask any questions, observations, contrary opinions. This is all about kind of sharing those ideas. And we try to get at a deeper understanding and deeper connection with drawing, as well as our artwork in general. And I just want to welcome you if you're new. All right, so one of the things that I'm kind of setting as a landmark here is this. There seems to be a break in that hill line, that ridge line, where it's a little bit smoother, and then we get this cluster of trees that sticks out. And I need to kind of evaluate the distance there. And it's about a third of the way, so I should be able to go 1, 2. So perhaps it's a little bit too far to the right. So I'm just looking at that distance here. So giving me that foreground landmark will then help me build in that background. And so if you're new and you're wondering what I'm doing, I have the reference image in front of me, closing one eye, and when I extend my arm, I can use the pencil as a guide. I can align it with the left side of the reference image, slide my finger down the length of it until it indicates this distance here, and then carry that across. So I'm taking this measurement, carrying that across there. And then I can do the same with the distance from the bottom. And what I notice is that essentially this distance from the left edge to this cluster of trees here is equivalent to the height. So I'm feeling pretty good in terms of that. And then if I go up from there, that's when you can start to see some of these forms in the valley emerge. So there's this one kind of noticeable notch here. And then I can move back and measure this overlapping form. And then as we move up here, I have to determine how far up I need to go. So there's a very visible kind of ridge there. If I drop a plumb line down, I can see where it might intersect with this foreground ridge. And I can compare that distance to the plumb line here. So basically the lateral distance between this, again, this landmark here that I've established, and then that peak. So I can compare that to the reference. And then it looks like, yeah, if this cluster of trees is 1/3 of the way in from the left, we can measure another third, and then another third. And the kind of crest of that mountain here is just to the left of that third. So just using some comparative measuring there to help me place those. And then you may find your own way through this process of creating accurate proportions. And so with that third now kind of established, I can address this hill line here, and I can observe that there's essentially a horizontal path there. The height of this mountain here is equivalent to the height here, and then there's some variation within that. And so rather than work in a one progression here, I'm kind of working back and forth, gradually narrowing that field. So working a little bit on the left, a little bit on the right, and you're kind of tweaking the placement of some of those forms as you move across. as we come across here, then we can move down to the this hillside here that becomes visible. And you can see where it exits the page. And it can be helpful to have a horizontal guide here. So if you run a horizontal line across here, you can see how it relates to these hills. And in that way, I feel like that helps to establish the height of this foreground mountain. So we're constantly making these evaluations in terms of scale and placement, comparing distant areas to those foreground areas. So there's two of those. There's kind of two dimensions that we're being aware of. We're being aware of the two-dimensional quality of the paper, this lateral organization of these materials, as well as the kind of implied depth that we can observe in the reference photo. All right, so it brings to mind some of the things that Cezanne would address in his paintings, where there is both kind of a two-dimensional design, the lateral design element that moves the viewer around the surface of the painting, and then using color and shape to create that depth. So you have like this contrasting cycle there, almost this contradiction in there. Those two things work together. So hello, Patricia, welcome. Glad to have you here. And viewing from Madison, Wisconsin. And then Nia is saying, how am I liking the Soho paper? I really enjoy it. So if you're wondering about this paper, this is a production sample. So that this isn't currently available in this size. You can buy it at a smaller size, however. I also have some kind of larger ones as well. So Jerry's is testing these out, and they sent me out some, and I thought I'd give it a shot. And I'm not sure when they're going to be available, but you can purchase this paper. Like I said, it's just a small size, and I think it works really well for sketching and kind of more finished drawings. So there's a versatility to it that I really like. Now, having said that, I always love my the cotton rag papers, but I think it's important to sometimes shake things up. I found myself really falling into this habit of using the same set of cotton rag papers, again, that I love, but when you change up the papers, it forces you to kind of confront your marks a little bit differently. That's kind of what we do as artists, is we challenge ourselves in ways to grow, and sometimes we need to throw a wrench in our system. So, all right. So as I'm coming down this hillside over here, there's multiple hills kind of in this space, multiple ridges, but I'm looking at the kind of the more visible one, and I can kind of follow down that edge, and it leads me to intersecting that foreground area, and I can observe where it intersects there, and it's happening to line up pretty much where I observe it to be lining up in the reference. So in this way, all of those things work together. So if I had kind of started drawing this hillside, come down here and seen that it intersects at this part of that foreground ridge, then I'd have to kind of step back and evaluate what's off. Is it this, or is it that ridge line? And then I can also compare that again to this distant mountain. If I draw a plumb line here, I can see where it would intersect with this ridge line here. So, and then as I do that, I can see that there's this kind of very subtle, farthest ridge, farthest mountain right back there, and that creates this notch, this intersection here, that's directly above that group of trees. Maybe it needs to come over to the left just a little bit, but it kind of orients those two again. So again, we're comparing in this vertical and horizontal way. We're comparing the background to the foreground. Let's see, what size do you print the reference photo out? 8 by 10? Yeah, I have it sized to an 8 by 10, so it should print out at that size. I don't actually work from the printout. I find that working with it on a screen, so like here off to my left where I'm observing, reading your comments, I have a bigger version of that. But if you are printing it out and you want to have it next to your drawing there where it's 1-to-1, you might consider printing it out at that 8 by 10 and then having a piece of paper that's 8 by 10. And that way you're kind of working the same kind of site size, as it were. Let's see. Oh, Pablo, I'm glad to see you here. Greetings from Frederick. All right, first time watching live. Well, I'm I'm glad you're able to watch us live. I miss Maryland. I went to college out there in Baltimore. And so I'm glad to see you here. And then Frida Stewart is asking what pencil sharpener I use. This is the pencil sharpener I use. It's this. It's a razor blade. So I just simply kind of carve it down like this to give myself a sharp point. And I like that because it just exposes more of the core of the pencil so I can use it on the side. And when you do that, it's constantly sharpening that tip so that I always have a nice fine edge for when I need it. At these early stages, I don't need that level of refinement because my understanding of the landscape isn't there yet. I haven't really observed the reference photo enough to get locked into those details. Right now, my current understanding of the subject is very surfacey. I just understand it as these shapes and values. And so I'm going to try to build into that slowly. So we're starting with these big shapes, moving into the refinement. And by sharpening it like this with more of that core exposed, using the side of the pencil, I always have that sharp edge available when I need it. So, and then let's see. Oh, okay, yeah, I can actually go through showing it. There's a question about from Rocket434. And so it's really just simply this. I kind of sneak up on it. I'm pushing with this thumb, stabilizing here. Sometimes I'm pulling backward at the same time, and simply refining it. And as you can play around with the angle of it. As you angle it more, it's going to grab more of that pencil. And as you level it out, it's going to shave off a little bit less. And you find that balance. And I've just kind of learned that through practice, trying to feel it. But you can just kind of feel it when it grabs that pencil. And it takes a fair amount of time, but I find that time up front, sharpening it like this, is saved in the drawing process from having to sharpen it throughout the process. And once I've sharpened it before I start, I don't really have to sharpen it again. It's pretty rare that I need to. So hopefully that makes sense. And the key is really to have a sharp blade. These materials, and when you sharpen it with charcoal as well, it can dull quite quickly. And then once it's dull, then that's when things really start to break. And I get really frustrated at myself because I'll be sharpening it and breaking off, and I'll keep sharpening it again, breaking off, and just getting frustrated when I should just stop, change out the blade, go for it. But I don't know what that is. All right. Oh, yes, and then Monica is asking if the Raphi grinder out yet. So I do have one of these here, one of these sanding blocks here that can also help to sharpen it. And that can be helpful during the process. So much of my drawing, though, is built using the side of the paper, and that's achieving essentially the same thing. With the tooth of the paper, it's going to start to sharpen your pencil. And so if I do find that my pencil is getting dull, then I'll just move to an area where I can build up broad areas of tone. And then the other key to that, too, is as while I'm building up an area, I'm just slowly rotating it in my fingers so that it rounds this out. I'm not developing any flat spots there. So now, I haven't addressed this yet, but for those of you who've been with the show for a while will have heard me say this quite a bit, is that there is an inherent challenge with value in that it's all relative, and we're constantly calibrating to the value relationships in the subject in front of us. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that we're constantly looking at the difference in values of light or dark between things, and we have a tendency to assign the light areas as white, the dark areas as black. And then if I look here, for example, my eye is going to naturally want to assign this as like the darkest dark, or maybe that area. But that's actually quite light. And as I lay increasingly darker values, it's going to change how I perceive some of these areas here, if that makes sense. So we're constantly recalibrating our understanding of the value relationships as they form. And I bring that up now because I need to keep that in mind as I go and not treat these as absolute values. So as I darken this area, I may need to go back in and adjust these distant areas. This may be too light and may be too dark, but I'm not really worried about getting it accurate at this point. I'm worried about basic value relationships. I just want to say that this area is darker than this is darker than that. And I'm going to keep building that with that in mind, and then as the as the forms start to emerge, then we start to become more specific and really start to dial in those values. And I guess that's kind of a metaphor for really everything in the drawing. It's really helpful, I think, to not trust any of your marks. So some of these marks may stay through the end of the drawing, but as I was saying earlier, I'm allowing my drawing to emerge at the same rate that my observations of the landscape are evolving. So you can look at this landscape and in an instant recognize what it is. And there's so many of those problems that your brain is solving for you to simply get to that basic understanding. And what we're doing is we're slowing that whole process down and really analyzing the specific shapes, value relationships, forms, the composition, etc. Everything that our brain processes in that split second, we're just trying to expand and slow down. And so our first pass is just to see this as a set of values and a set of shapes that all interrelate. And then as we gather more information about the forms and get into those details, then we start to indicate that on the paper. So we start to indicate those as we've taken time to really study the form. And I kind of say that because for me, at least when I was starting out drawing, I would put so much pressure on myself to understand the form right away. So I'd take a split second kind of observation of the subject, and in that instant, just looking at this landscape in an instant, you know what it is, right? And so that's what I would build my drawing on, is that split second observation. And I would put a lot of pressure on myself to then render the drawing based on that initial impression and that snap judgment. And often it would be off because I hadn't really taken time to understand it. And that's the beauty of drawing, is that it connects us to the world around us. It connects us to our own minds, the biases that we might come to the world with. And it allows us to kind of step back and see it all as a whole, really slow things down, and understand it with greater depth and appreciation. So, all right. So I think at this point I'm going to start to indicate. I love this area down in here as a focal point. That it helps to balance that light that we get kind of pulled back into here. And so there's this really strong diagonal thrust in the composition. So the other thing I'm doing is, if you haven't done it already, is to set your drawing up vertically and look at it from a distance and to see how it is all coming together. So at this point, I'm going to do some subtractive drawing, lifting up some of these light areas, and I can indicate some of these hills. And I'm just making an initial judgment based on how it feels, moving my eyes back and forth quickly between the reference photo and the drawing, because I'm seeing what you're seeing right now. So I'm seeing the reference photo and the drawing next to it vertically. That's capturing the view from the camera above me. And ideally, if we think about the relationship between the amount of time we spend looking at the drawing and the amount of time we spend looking at the reference, I think ideally, for me, I would be spending probably about 75% of the time looking at the reference and really understanding the subject, and about 25% of the time kind of executing on the page. I think of, to come back to Cezanne, I had read that, he would kind of mix and mix and mix on the palette. He would study, mix and mix and mix, and then make a mark, and then kind of step back and mix and look and mix and look, and make a mark. I remember seeing that there's an exhibit of Monet here at the Denver Museum, and you could see in the video, you can find this video online of him painting his water lilies, and you can observe, like, if you watch him, you know, he's looking, he's mixing, he's looking, mixing, looking at his canvas, mixing, looking, and then he'll go up and he'll strike it. You know, he'll make that mark, and then he'll step back and he'll look at the subject, look at his palette, look at the subject, look at the palette, look at the painting, look at the subject, back and forth, and then make the mark. And for me, I found that it often helps the drawing to spend less time drawing. You know, and in that way, you know, I try to make every mark count. But that's a kind of, I think, a question for you all, is what your thoughts are on that. So just kind of, again, doing some subtractive drawing, making some marks that help to indicate some of these areas. So what I'm looking at is I created creating a plumb line across here. This mark got really smudged, so I need to wipe that out. Just drawing a horizontal guide across there to compare it with. There's this, it almost looks like a ski run, the way that meadow emerges there. Again, I'm not worried about an absolute values at this point. I'm just kind of establishing value relationships. And then by using an eraser subtractively like this, it can create a more gentle edge sometimes. All right, Lady Hawk Leslie, 46 in North Texas. That's cold for Texas, I imagine. Yeah, we had 32 this morning. Mad Mum Must Go, hello from Bonnie, Scotland. Hello. And then Brian, welcome, first time UK. Awesome. And Kathy, welcome, Northwest England. So cool. And then Troy, all right, welcome. I'm glad you've been looking forward to it, me as well. All right, what do I want to do now? So I'm feeling pretty confident about the overall shapes here. I think what I want to do is I want to give myself a little bit more information on this foreground ridge here. You know, this is going to be almost black down in this area, so I'm not worried about it going too dark. So I know I'm going to end up having to go even darker, but I think it's just going to help me to capture the atmosphere in this. And I think if I'm looking at some of these major forms, I'm feeling pretty confident about the overall structure here. I'm just going to give myself a little bit of an indication of some of these tree forms here, because I think I want to have a fairly high level of refinement there to help pull the eye on this side, because I can kind of trust that soft atmosphere and that glowing light will be sufficient for pulling the eye back this way. And so kind of balancing those two, that big soft light up here and then these finer refined details in this area here should balance one another. And then I'm going to, as we get down to those areas, I'm going to talk about things like concave and convex forms. There's kind of an implied straight line there, which is kind of cool. It's subtle, but I like the way it kind of stabilizes that form. It contrasts against some of the angles of that hillside. And there's this hill here. So I'm kind of working my way back towards that distance, and as I do that, then I will then work my way back forward again. Now one of the things I like to see is that tooth of the paper is already starting to suggest some of the texture, and I'm going to formulate a plan, I think, a little bit to utilize that as much as I can to my advantage. So I'm kind of making a mental note So again, my eyes are fairly soft and out of focus, and one of the things that that achieves is it helps me to see these as abstract forms. I know for myself, I get into trouble once I start to identify the subject. As I start to think about those as trees, then it starts to bring back all of my symbolic understanding of a tree. And that can influence the marks I make, because I've spent years and years drawing trees. And I don't want to be relying on what I did in the past. I want to be thinking about what is present here. What do these things look like? There's always kind of part of that drawing process that is trying to kind of shed those earlier drawings, all of my understanding of the past, and identify with this specifically. So it's this weird balance of relying on all your previous experience and your expertise to help guide your drawing process, while simultaneously trying to get rid of all of that and try to see this for what it is. And by allowing your gaze to soften and see things somewhat out of focus, it can help you to see these as abstract forms. All right, so I'm going to soften that down a little bit, just using the palm of my hand to do that. All right, so now actually what do I want to do? I think I want to do the sky right now. Rocket434, you're drawing on marker paper. Awesome. Oh, and hello from Iraq. That's awesome. Welcome, welcome. And the Nia saying the grass matches the tan paper really well. Is that why you chose it? Yes, that's pretty much. I wanted to use this paper, and I had this reference image, and as I was going through the reference, yes, that's perfect right there. So I really like that yellow there. It's very close to the tone. And one of the things that's really helpful for me, or what I wanted to address, is as we're thinking about value, what trips me up all the time is when you have a highly saturated color, my tendency is to see that as a lighter value than it might actually be, right? And so as I look down in here, my instinct is to try to create something lighter, but I'm going to trust that that the tone of the paper is going to be sufficient for those light areas. And then as I move back in here, I'll actually lighten the value. And so we're kind of modulating that contrast by making the darker areas here darker. It makes that feel lighter and has an equivalent value relationship to this area here. Hopefully that makes sense. We'll see. Hello from Eureka and Holland. All right, welcome. It's good to see all your familiar names. We're seeing some good numbers here. Tell all your friends, have them join. Say, hey, these drawing sessions are a lot of fun. All right, so I'm actually going to clean up this a little bit along that ridge line, just enough so I can see the kind of the indication of it, but I don't want there to be a lot of material there when I add the white. So here we go. I'm just going to use the side of this. Let me do this side. So doing some negative drawing there. So I'm thinking about the shape of that hillside, but I'm trying to capture that through the negative space there. And right away when I look up at the drawing, and you can see how, sorry, I'm just trying to focus a little bit here. But you can see what it does to my understanding of value as a whole, right? Now all of a sudden this really changes. And then I'm just going to fill this all in here. I may have to continue to adjust that hillside. So I'm going to use that to indicate that ridge line there, but I may have to adjust that a little bit more. Just going to use this to indicate some of these areas here, and then fill this back in. And I'm just going to let this sit, I think, or do I want to blend it? I don't know what I want to do. I think the direction of the marks is, right now, I didn't really put much thought into that, and that could come back to bite me. So I think I need to address those marks. It's going to take. Actually, I'm going to take my finger and then just lightly spread it. If I push too hard, it's going to lift up too much of the sketch square. And I have to look at the camera, that overhead view, because the way the light is reflecting off me, I'm not quite getting as accurate a view as I'm seeing on the screen as what you're seeing. So it looks smoother from my perspective here, and I look up at the screen, I see all this variation. All right. I look forward to seeing you using pastel paper with tinted charcoal. All right, let's see how that goes. And then Rocket 434, how much does this paper cost? You know, I don't know. This is paper that's not available to the public yet. This size, you can buy the smaller. It's like 5.5 by 8 or 5.5 by 7, something like that. Is a smaller kind of travel sketchbook size. And it's a really affordable paper, and I really like it. But hopefully they'll make this available to the public soon. I think what I want to do is actually, I'm going to just gently bring down some of that tone just to soften that edge a little bit. And we're going to stay in this area for a while now. I think what we're going to do is now work our way from the background to the foreground. I'm just going to, again, soften that edge. And now you can use an eraser to refine some of these edges a little bit more if you need it. And then we can essentially keep that. I don't know if I want to do that. So kind of thinking through my strategy right here. If I let this be the natural tone of that distant mountain, I could run into trouble with comparing it to this. So if I'm using this for its color and value here, by replicating and repeating that color here, it could flatten things out. So I think what I actually need to do is I need to affect the tone here. So I'm actually going to lay down some of this. Actually, let's just go for it. Let's go for this. I'm going to wipe it down. See what happens. But I'm going to show you what I'm going to do now. So now that paper is kind of obscured, I can come back in here and refine the edge again a little bit more. And if I need to render this distant mountain, actually, I'm gonna come back in with my kind of harder graphite and let the white and the graphite blend together. And so that way I'm achieving that depth, but I'm able to isolate the tone of the paper here. So by mixing the white and the graphite together, hopefully I'm able to achieve an equivalent value. And I'm going to come back up here. So this is really just a light touch, and I'm starting from the kind of the center of the form and working my way up to that edge. And as I'm working up to that edge, I'm kind of going to gradually tilt the pencil to engage the tip a bit more where I have a bit more precision. But it's a really soft pressure because I want there to be an even tone. And actually, I'm not going to worry about this bottom edge here because we're going to layer that foreground mountain on top of that in a little bit. Let's see what happens if I bring in, this is a well-used blending stump. Just to try to help to get rid of some of the directionality of the marks. So, we did some work earlier to establish this hillside. We're just going to have to do that again, I think. I'm going to have to do it again. Use the blending stump here. It's got a little bit of graphite on it already. And I'm going to just kind of indicate some of these lost and found edges. And that'll help to really enhance that sense of atmosphere. And there's this ridge line here that we can indicate. Just using the blending stump to do that. All right, and then I can kind of step back. When I see it in the camera, I can observe there's some kind of blotchy areas. So I think I want this to be more of a consistent tone. And what I'm going to do is target those light areas. So there's another light area here. Kind of fill that in now. Target that area, fill that in, and then gradually make it more even. I'm going to let this fade off a little bit here in hopes that it will pull attention here. So as we're compositionally, as we're moving up along this ridge from this high contrast area back into that sky, we don't continue to run off the edge by having a sharp kind of exit at that part of the page. All right. As I'm working back in here, this is all about touch right now. It's all very gentle, and I'm starting with as light a touch as possible on the page. And if I need to achieve something darker, I can lean in on it a little bit more. I want to check the chat real quick, but I need to kind of focus a little bit on this area. So I think I want to sharpen up this edge here. So now I'm just going to bring these values down. Again, I'm not worried about that edge because we'll be able to then redefine that distant hillside. All right. All right. Thank you, Susan, for those comments there. So yeah, I'm happy with the way the light is starting to emerge. And then kind of keeping that composition in mind, I'm intentionally leaving this area a little bit more dull. I want there to be a hot spot back in there again to keep us kind of engaged in the center of the composition a bit more. All right. What do I have here? Got my 12B that I'm going to bring out later. So now we can start to move forward. I'm going to sharpen that just a little bit with a bit of a line. move forward and capture this hillside here. So just giving myself a little bit of an indication of where I need to go, but again, kind of starting with the center of the form. Actually, I think I need to be more conscious of the direction of my marks, and I'm going to make these vertical. Because what happens if I make marks running this way, that run parallel to that ridge line, it could kind of flatten things out. Instead, I want to be aware of that edge and then create these vertical marks that lead up to that edge. Just starting with a light pressure, trying to visualize that path, and hold it in my mind, and then create these marks that stop along that edge. And if I do have to do a line here, I just got to be really careful because I don't want there to be a hard line. Try to smooth that out a little bit, blend it some. And then as I'm looking more closely at this ridge here, this hillside, this mountainside, I'm seeing this contrast in light and shadow. So my first attempt is to simply create an average value here, and then we'll come back in and create some of that subtle variation of light and shadow that creates that form there. All right, so I'm going to use the blending stump now. And as I'm doing this, I'm trying to really be mindful of the pressure along along each stroke, because if I'm too heavy at the ends or the start of each stroke, it's going to create these kind of burrs. And if anything, what I'm trying to do is apply pressure at the center of the strokes so that I have soft edges, and that helps to blend things. And using the circular motion here to help create that smooth tone. And I'm going to use this to do a little bit of line work to refine that edge. But using the blending stump so it's a more gentle indication of that edge here. All right, how's everybody doing? Everybody else drawing along? Anybody just watching? Anybody using totally different materials? We've heard from some of you already, but if you're new, what you're watching is Drawing Together with Artist Network. My name's Scott Maier. All right, so as I'm kind of holding in my mind the placement of kind of this foreground mountain here, but I'm going right over the edge. I want there to be a smooth transition. If I had indicated a line here and I was being kind of delicate along that edge, I run the risk of creating these unnatural halos. And one of the tricks, the challenges when working with atmosphere like this is if you look at the reference photo along those ridge lines, it can feel like there's kind of like this fluting effect, right, where it's getting lighter along that edge, and then it gets darker, and that's the effect of simultaneous contrast. And so the reality is that these are solid tones, but whenever you have a lighter edge abutting a darker edge, the light's going to feel lighter, the dark's going to feel darker right along that edge. It's just the natural effect of that contrast. And so what I do is I start by creating even tones, and if it doesn't quite have the look that I'm going for, then I can go in and lighten up along that edge or darken along the edge. But see what naturally occurs by just working with those solid values, and use that simultaneous contrast to your advantage. And if it creates that sense of that halo that we could sometimes pick up in the reference, if it creates that naturally, then you don't really have to do anything more. So what should happen is that even though this is a solid value, this should feel lighter because it's abutting a darker edge. And this should feel darker along this edge because it's abutting something that's lighter than it. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's see. Lady Hawk Leslie, I'm drawing with colored pencils on smoothish paper. Awesome. Working on the green background. Nice. For a butterfly. So, and then he is asking, which subject do you prefer drawing most among landscapes, portrait, and still life? It's hard. I think I'm really a landscape person at heart, but that's one of the things I like about this show is it's kind of forced me to engage with other subjects more. You know, so there's also just the act of drawing, right? That you know, and the satisfaction of drawing can always be there, regardless of the subject. And I think for me, it's really more about that experience. So it can generally be equivalent, between subjects. But I think if I were to have to choose between them, I would say landscape. So what's happening here is you can see that little dot. There's a slight imperfection on the paper, and that's just going to happen with all papers. They're going to have some sort of slight imperfection, and it's holding a little bit more of the material. So I'm just going to use my my kneaded eraser to try to tap that out a little bit, and then smooth it. All right. What do I want to do here? I need to. I'll grab the 3B again. And then there's this one mountain line along in here that we just catch a little sliver of. So I'm just gradually just getting a little bit darker as I move forward. But that's a good question, Nia, and I'm kind of curious what everybody else has to say. Do you all have preferred subjects? Sharpen this subtle ridge line here as well. Just using these circular marks to help kind of blend a little bit. Now, I have to keep in mind now what's happening is that, and I've got an equivalent value here as I do here, but I know that I'm going to go a lot darker here. So I just kind of have to trust things a little bit because the way it looks now, it makes me want to lighten that up, because I'm comparing it to this, and it may not be what's good for me. I may end up having to actually lighten that area, but I don't want to make that decision until I've established more of the context and I've established that foreground area. So I'm just going to rely a little bit on the tooth of the paper. You can start to see some subtle contrast and texture forming there. I'm going to work my way up here. Actually, I think I'm going to use a blending stump here to smooth out this distant ridge along in here. Create a little bit of contrast. And then try to bring this forward a little bit more. So like I said, I may end up having to lighten this up. It does feel a little bit strong. What happens if I'm going to try something. I'm just going to grab a little bit of this white on the side of my fingers and try to mix those together. That might be a little bit too subtle. Here, I'm going to try something. I'm going to use this white. Charcoal pencil here. So instead of lifting it with the eraser, I'm going to actually mix it with the white. I'm kind of curious to see what this is going to do. It's kind of a bit of an experiment. You can see that this charcoal is picking up some of the graphite. And I can sharpen that edge a little bit. Right in here, I can lift off a little bit. So I'm really just kind of working back and forth now. Instead of lifting with the eraser, because the eraser is actually going to reveal some of that yellow, and I want to isolate that yellow here. I'm going to try to modulate the value using this white charcoal, letting them mix, and so then I get this warm and cool color shift. I'll let that soften a little bit. So I'm just doing these really light washes with the with this charcoal pencil. Let's see how it all works out. So one of the things I'm looking at doing is when I squint at the reference photo, there's an alignment. There's kind of a closer value relationship between these two mountains than what I'm seeing on the page. There's too much separation there. And all right, I don't think it's not really lightening up the way I want to, so now I'm going to go in and try to lift off a little bit and see how that color might be working. Make sure there's not too much of that color of the paper showing through. And I can kind of gently tap and reveal some of the light along in here to create some of that contrast of light and shadow. So it's all very subtle in here, but I think some of those subtle variations can really make this work. Adding a little bit more detail along this edge. Again, if you're new, you're wondering what we're watching, this is Drawing Together with Artist Network. This is episode 118. So if you're looking for other subjects, and we've done quite a few, so we'll alternate between, did a whole series of animal portraits. We've got people portraits of all kinds, others, still lifes, more landscapes. So and I just finished the kind of plans for the rest of the year. So we have more of that to come. All right, so now I'm kind of happier with that relationship. I allowed some of that color to show through, but I feel like there's still, right now, there's still enough contrast between those two. It helps to provide a transition back to this more achromatic hillside back there. And then we get some light areas in here. I can bring a little bit more refinement to that valley floor. All right, let's see. All right, just focusing a little bit because I'm trying to really kind of dial in this distant area here. All right, so I think I'm happy with that. I'm going to go back to the 3B to work here. So you can see that we're kind of moving in and out of the space. And I think what I need to do is really drop in some darker values here just as a reference. Kind of losing some of my reference points here. And this isn't as dark as I can go, but hopefully it'll be enough to give me some of those indications. So just switching to this overhand grip, those short vertical marks to indicate some of those trees there. All right, and that helps me to see those value relationships a little bit more clearly. And that's all to help me with this area along in here. How are we doing on time? We're about an hour and 10 minutes in, so we've got about an hour left. We generally kind of finish these in about 2 hours for these drawings. You know, feel free to throw out any observations, questions. Yeah, again, that's why we're drawing together. And as I'm working through here, I'm trying to think about the primary value relationship is going from light to dark in the foreground. And as I start to isolate these areas, I'm looking at this area here, I need to constantly be comparing it to something back there. And so what can be helpful sometimes is look at this area of the reference image, but put your awareness on what's happening over here. Try to evaluate those values and evaluate the shapes. And so what I'm doing is I'm looking for kind of an average value here that I'm then going to go back in and kind of refine further with darker shadow shapes. And letting the tooth of the paper kind of show through it just kind of naturally captures that the texture of the trees there. And I do have a larger reference image, but I'm avoiding looking at that again because this forces me to see the whole structure of the scene a bit more. I'm trying to actively fight against that part of me that wants to really get in there and render all the details. You can express so much with just a shape that's placed well. And I want to try to achieve that rather than really try to fight for a high level of detail. So I'm observing there's this value shift here where it gets a little bit lighter down in this area and a little bit darker as we move up here. I just caught myself on those marks. I just need to evaluate that I don't have marks that are really dominantly showing in that direction. I'm kind of curious is like if what you all think about that in terms of the direction of the marks. You know, I know for some artists it's kind of a bigger deal. I think for me I put a big emphasis on it, but kind of curious what you all think. How important is it to you to pay attention to the direction of the marks? All right. Let me see. Troy, I just started oil painting and have never drawn, so I always watch it first and then rewatch. Oh, that's awesome. I hope you're enjoying the oil painting. Well, I'm glad that you enjoy it. Oh, and then Susan, you love drawing with metal point. Holy smokes. That is a fun medium. That's a hard one. No pun intended. Well, I guess the pun is intended. It is a very hard material, so it kind of forces the hand to draw in a particular way. But yeah, I love the quality of those, the delicacy and the fine details you can get. Monica saying I like animals mostly and landscapes would be my second choice. And then Rocket 434 trying to erase out the mist rather than apply with the light. So that's awesome. I'm curious to see how that works for you. Oh, Brian is saying my paper choice is pastel matte. and if your question is should you have an alternative, I think it's always helpful to shake things up. And when moving to a medium that challenges you, it can reveal a new set of techniques, new approaches, new understandings about the form. And so I think as part of a healthy studio practice, it can be helpful to have a variety of papers. Just recognizing that some of them are going to challenge you more, and you may not get the results you're looking for. But if your end goal is to simply achieve a deeper understanding, a deeper connection to the drawing and the subject, sometimes shaking up the materials can do that effectively. All right. So as I'm building these details here, one of the things that I'm also trying to do is I'm constantly checking in where I am relative to other landmarks on the page, because it's so easy just to get isolated in my thoughts and just focus, say, on this cluster of trees, and that's really the nature of focus. It's hard because I feel like in many ways sharp focus does a disservice to the drawings, and I'm constantly fighting that urge to just dial in one area. But when we do that, we necessarily ignore everything else, and it tends to grow in our minds. We kind of lose sense of the scale. We prioritize value and detail and clarity over that sense of unity in the scene there. And so as I'm going through, my eyes are really kind of blurred, and I'm trying to just see these shapes, these masses as just abstract shapes. And I'm moving in and out of focus. So right now everything is just soft and out of focus. Now everything is in focus, and I can start to refine and add some detail. So I kind of have an average value now that kind of represents the light areas of the trees, and I can apply a little bit more pressure to capture some of those darker shadow forms. Kind of lean in on the pencil to sharpen up an edge, so right along in here, if I want this rounded hill to have a little bit more clarity, I could just kind of roll my hand a little bit to engage the tip a bit more. Troy is saying, I think the direction of the marks makes a big difference when showing different objects, one going one direction, the other object in a different direction. That's awesome. Yeah, it definitely, that's the way I conceive of it as well. It's so much about creating that spatial separation between the forms. And if everything's moving in one direction, it kind of fights against that. But then you look at artists like Leonardo, for example, who would use directional marks to shade an area. And it creates this kind of sense of atmosphere in the drawings. And so you might have a set of diagonal marks that almost act like a wash across a broad area. So for me, I like to have some directional marks that really align with the cross contour of the form. But then I see other artists that kind of break that trend. And all right, so now I'm going in. This is the 3B, so I'm not going to go any darker than the 3B. I'm going to save the 12B for this, so it should go quite a bit darker. Actually, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try something. I feel like there's just too much of that paper showing through in the highlights, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of wash over this whole area with a blending stump. Now I'm losing that tooth of the paper, which gives me some of that texture that I'm going for. But I'm going to try to get that back by layering darker marks on top. So let me go for it again now, reestablish some of these areas. And one of the advantages to using the side of the pencil is it gives me a variety of marks. I'm not really using the tip. I'm still using this overhand grip on purpose because I can get fine lines if I need to. I can get broad strokes. I can control the pressure a little bit better. And it's just kind of just modulating my gaze a little bit. So right now, everything's out of focus. I'm flooding my eyes right now. So opening them wide to allow a lot of light to come in, but allowing the image to be out of focus, allowing my drawing to be out of focus. And then you gradually bring them in to focus, and then kind of into a squint to limit the amount of light, and also losing focus that way. You know, I'm kind of curious about you all, if anybody else it kind of works that way as well. But I think really an important part of my drawing practice is to consider what my eyes are doing as an optical instrument. What are they doing? And then how do I understand the subject differently as I manipulate my eyes a little bit? You know, so again, squinting, bring them into sharp focus, opening wide to allow them to flood with light. All of that influences the information that I'm gleaning from the subject. And there's a point in the drawing process at which everything clicks, and you start to really see this as a mountainside. I love that when that happens in painting as well. And I'm out on in the landscape where, you know, it goes from kind of a mess on the surface to all of a sudden it's a three-dimensional space, and that's for me when things really start to take off in the drawing. All right, so I'm going to shift. There's this darker hillside here. I'm going to switch to this vertical kind of orientation of the pencil. And rather than try to draw every little tree, I'm going to start with this mass here. And as I get up to the top of that form, you can see there's a bit of a kind of like a camber to this. There's a bit of a curve. And the pencil can kind of rock on that tip. And as I move forward, you know, I can change the angle here to change that shape. But it's just these kind of quick marks here that feel kind of like a naturally formed tree. So I'm not trying to draw each tree with this tripod grip and kind of draw them down. I'm actually pushing up into that space and then kind of moving across that form. So I'm trying to take in that overall form. And one of the things I'm thinking about is you know, varying the marks. I want to be careful of evenly spaced, kind of rhythmic marks. Those things don't typically exist in nature, and when we see them, it pulls our attention. And so you can use that to your advantage. If there's an area where you really want to attract the viewer's gaze, maybe you start to become a little bit more kind of consistent, more regular, more rigid in some of those marks. And where you want the viewer to kind of just accept it as natural, you end up having more kind of irregular, inconsistent marks. Now, along this edge, it's all very subtle, but think about the relationship between the concave and convex marks. You know, there's kind of a general kind of oval shape to this mass here, but if you look along this bottom edge, I've kind of exaggerated a little bit, so I might kind of trim that down a little bit, but there's this constant shift along in here because this hillside cuts in on top of that. And so what's helping to define those spatial relationships is the layering of the concave and convex marks. So this is kind of convex here. The grass is kind of convex, pushing into the shape of the trees, that brings that forward. Now this shape here is convex against that, which puts this on top of that. And so there's this a kind of interrelationship between those, and it can be very subtle, but that can sometimes make the spatial relationships, that definition, really work. If I switch this to if I switch that relationship and make this convex onto this concave grass, then I run the risk of this popping forward. If I do that even more so, we might lose some of that definition. So by kind of changing that up, it helps to really kind of lock that group of trees back into that space. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, Susan's saying, draw with a solid rod of silver and copper. That's so cool. Yeah, silver point. That's wild. I remember seeing the drawings of Ungra and the silver point and just kind of blowing my mind. All right, so now I'm going to work down in here to kind of capture this foreground area. Do some, pay attention to the negative space here, the positive and negative spatial relationships. How big of this area should it be? And I'm going to really just block this in. I see variation down there, but I'm going to treat it like a solid shape. Susan, I imagine with silver point it's really difficult to kind of block in like this, but I've never really worked with it. I'm kind of curious what paper you use for silver point. All right. So I'm just evaluating. I'm making these horizontal marks, and they're dangerous because it could kind of flatten things out. I feel like a vertical mark is more appropriate here, but I don't think those horizontal marks were as dominant as they could be. All right, so I think that works out okay. And I'm going to kind of push into this to indicate some of those trees. And so with this hillside, there's this vertical motion of the pencil with this kind of horizontal direction of my hand, and that creates that. All right, so then as I move up here, I can really lay on the pressure and go darker with this. I just want to be really careful not to have a consistent line. I want to break that up, and that's what's going to help to create that sense of atmosphere and depth, is if along that edge I have a sufficient amount of variation. All right. I think what I want to do actually is I'm just going to fill in this whole area using the 3B. Just creating a wash. Now, one of the things I have to be aware of, considerate of, is that I'm flattening out, smoothing out the tooth of the paper, so it may make it harder for darker layers to kind of accept onto the page. So I had to be, I don't know, this could have been a bad choice. Perhaps I should have just gone into it with the 12B, but so there's this thin line here. What I'm going to do along in here is I'm going to visualize that path, but I'm going to create it with these short vertical vibrations, which will hopefully help make it feel more like a thin shadow than a line. So sometimes just changing the direction of those marks can make a big difference in how we interpret that form. So, all right, as I come down here, I can, there's a little bit of light on that field. I can lift out. There's this thin sliver of the road. that I'm making larger than it actually is. And then I can come back into it and kind of carve away. It's all very subtle. All right, I think what I need to do is actually, I need to blend this a little bit, get rid of some of those, the flecks of the paper that are showing through, I think are affecting that. Now I run the risk of, again, kind of losing the tooth of the paper, but we'll see. Well, I think it's just starting to come together. I'm feeling like the overall essence of the scene is starting to form. So I think we're in the ballpark. Now we can continue to refine it. Pablo, you're cooking while you're watching. Awesome. I'm glad you like it. So Susan uses arches, but have some new papers from Legion and using canvas boards as well. Yeah, we love the Legion papers here. I've been using the Coventry, the Rives BFK is perhaps my favorite, as well as Stonehenge, arches. So very cool. And then you coat it with a ground. That makes a lot of sense just because it's at the harder material. You need to accept it a little bit more, I imagine. All right. Now what I'm responding to now is the depth of the values here. So right now my brain is saying that's all shadow because of that solid shape. So now I want to see what happens if I pull out the big gun. I've got the 12B. It's a very soft material, and so I'm gonna come back in and now I'm gonna lay in some even darker values and see what it does to my understanding of this area here. Because there's a little bit of light that catches those trees. So before I lift any of that, though, I want to get kind of my darkest dark established. I feel like that can be kind of lifted up because this is that field, that pasture there that's a little bit lighter in value. But since that's the darkest that can go, it's not quite dark enough. So I'm going to bring out my eraser here. And now with so much graphite built up on it, what I'm going to expect is that my initial pass, if I use just a light touch, it's really just going to move the graphite around. It's not going to lift it a whole lot, which is kind of what I want because I don't want that bare paper to be showing. So I'm starting with this kind of light touch. And I'm running these vertically to kind of align with the overall texture. You can see how it's just picking up that graphite. I don't know if you can see it on the tip of the eraser, but that's fine. And there's a little bit of light catching in this distant field here. So now I'm just going to keep making passes over this with increasing pressure. Kind of lifting as much as I can, but I just want, now I need to constantly be checking in those value relationships there. Now I feel like that's perhaps a bit too much. So I can come back with just a light wash with the graphite to knock that down a little bit. Do some negative drawing by drawing the dark area behind those trees. And then there's this cluster of trees here. I'm just going to kind of lightly indicate. So there's a fairly heavy pressure, but I'm trying not to be too precise with it. So now I'm just kind of evaluating it in the context of the whole. If I put my focus on this and just kind of ignore everything else, it skews my understanding of the value relationship. So I need to actually be looking up here, but putting my awareness down here to see how they relate to one another. And I feel like that's working out okay. As I squint, they hold up all right. And then here there's a bit of a kind of a pasture that's in shadow. So I'm just using these vertical marks there and using some subtle contrast to define some of these lighter areas in the shadow. And as I really kind of absorb myself in this foreground hill, I start to see kind of some really subtle shifts of light and dark. I think I want to kind of smooth things out a little bit. This gets really dark in here, so maybe what I need to do is go as dark as I can on this corner. Again, using this overhand grip, you saw me break off the tip of the pencil earlier. That's fine. I don't need that fine point to create the details. If I use the side of the pencil here, I'm actually sanding down the pencil core to give myself a sharp tip. Oop, I just broke that. Well, that's not going to work now. So let me sharpen this. This is a demo on how I sharpen the pencil. And this 12B is so soft. It's just like butter. That's why I really like these Cezanne pencils. So I just have to be a little careful with those. It's so soft. I really chew through these pencils like crazy, so I need to have a bunch of them on hand. These 12Bs. They just feel so nice and smooth. All right, so that's pencil sharpening. There was a question about that earlier, so now you've seen it. All right, so back to this. I need to be a little bit more conscious of the pressure on the pencil there. So I'm actually going to support it a little bit more. And what I observe is that this is a really steep hillside here. It's hard to make out the forms there in the individual trees. With these being larger, though, I want to use that to my advantage. So then you can start to relate the shapes from foreground to this distant area here. So similar shapes but different scale. And so if I keep the tree marks here the same on this side as I do over here, then I'm not going to have that to my advantage in terms of creating depth. And so I just kind of make a larger kind of triangular mark. Again, just using the side of the pencil. Trying to think about how to vary some of these marks. And this can be one of the advantages to working from the digital reference on your screen versus the printout. I don't know if the subtle values here would really show up in a print. Sometimes that gets lost, and so just to kind of be mindful of that. Or maybe if you're working from a printout, use it in conjunction with the digital reference. All right, so now that what was dark feels really light because I have this even darker area. All right, so I'm going to kind of start by darkening some of these areas. I need to ask myself, how much information do I really want over on this side? Because again, I talked about earlier about compositionally bringing the viewer's gaze from this area where we have kind of high contrast and detail back to this area. I feel like this is really distracting me up along in this edge here. I'm just going to soften that up a little bit, make that even more subtle. There, I feel like that's a little bit better. This is kind of distracting me too much. I'm going to knock this down. All right. Okay. And then Troy is asking, was there something about the drawing that would suggest using pencils over charcoal, or is that just what you prefer to this drawing? I think I think ultimately, if I were to kind of describe why I chose graphite, it's because I did the last drawing in charcoal. So that was really it. Now I know with these pencils, I can get pretty dark. If I didn't have this 12B that allow me to go as dark as I can here, then I may have chosen charcoal just to have that full contrast and values. But I also kind of like that silvery quality, the metallic quality of the graphite, which can really kind of add to that sense of atmosphere and light. There you can really start to see some subtle shifts in here that create the structure of this hillside. So what I'm evaluating now as I move across this, I need to evaluate whether or not this is reading like a wall or a hill that has depth. So down in here, because of just this little shape of the road, which isn't quite accurate, but that helps to create that shift. And I have some shifts in value that work up from the bottom up to that edge that help to create that sense of that rounded quality of the hill, that plane that recedes away from us. And as I move across here, I need to evaluate how much of that do I need in this area. Because right now it's starting to feel like a wall, but I also don't want to have too much detail. So I'm going to start by observing the shapes leading up to this edge, and intentionally not using a line to define that edge, but rather just a sharp edge. And I'm going to build it from there to see if there's anything else that I need. And we have this kind of slope here where it's a little bit smoother. And then we have these trees that stand out with more definition here. That was my landmark earlier that I used. I'm just kind of work my way down the hillside, evaluating that value shift and evaluating that edge to make sure it feels like there's some light and life to it. Whew, I was just realizing I have to breathe sometimes. The last thing I want to do is pass out on camera here, so but oh my gosh, sometimes I find that I'm just holding my breath. Let's see. Yeah, there are these kind of darker shadow lines that I think are important here because of that contrast in angles from this angle to these. That'll help to create some visual separation. I think we're pretty close to done. I don't know as if I want to do a whole lot more. Maybe I'll sit with it for a little bit since we got a little bit of time left. I feel like there's just still too much of a glow happening here, so I'm going to apply a wash to this, just keep knocking this down. And yeah, I feel like overall this is working out pretty well. So now what I want to do is I'm going to kind of sit with it a little bit. I'm going to come back to some of the questions here. Oh, okay. That is what I tried. Troy is saying I tried combining the two, but had already damaged the structure of the paper, and the charcoal really would not grab on. Yeah, it's really difficult to apply charcoal on top of graphite because graphite is so slick. Yeah, like you said, it removes the tooth of the paper, so they don't really work well together. Now there are some darker. I don't know if I actually have any here, but like some kind of more wax-based drawing materials that could work in that to get a really rich dark. So you might consider that instead of the charcoals. If you want to use graphite for the lighter areas, and maybe switch to one of those kind of more wax or oil-based drawing materials rather than the charcoal. Let's see. Yeah, so the Nia is asking, does the Cezanne 12B pencil come in a bigger set with the entire range from hard to soft? Yes. So this is the set that I have. This is one of them. I got a few of them. So this is my older one that I've already utilized some of the pencils. But you can see it goes from the 2H is the hardest all the way up to the 12B. And so that's why I really kind of like that. It's got that real strong bias to the softer ones. Although hearing Susan's comments about working with this metal point, though, kind of makes me want to kind of try out some of the harder graphites, which kind of gets closer to that. You're never going to quite get as hard as the metal point, but yeah, that sounds really exciting. Dita van Stiprian is at the edge of the top of the first mountain. It's like a softer tone. I'm not quite sure which one's which. So I think, what do I want to do here? I'm happy with this one. I feel like this mountain here, I don't want to add too much detail, but I think I want to refine that edge. So as I think about refining the edge, I'm actually going to degrade it right now. And then with a really light touch, and these circular marks, try to work up to find that edge. And that's again a term that I'm using specifically because I'm trying to break my habit of referring to detail, because I feel like refinement is really more of an accurate description of what I'm going for. What pulls our attention and which makes things feel kind of complete is how much we refine an edge, how sharp that edge is. And then oftentimes by having a sharper edge, it can start to imply more detail. We let the viewer's mind fill in a little bit more detail that way. So I'm holding the pencil really far back here because it allows me to achieve an even lighter pressure. I do think I want to, I think this hill here needs a little bit of a sharper edge. And that brings that forward just a little bit. And I talked about letting this kind of fade out, but I think it does it too much, so I'm going to add a little bit more of definition. Try to find that balance. I think I want to clarify this edge a little bit more here. So just kind of really soft marks there, but I just want to sharpen those edges up. I can let this be soft. How does this? I didn't quite get that shape here right when compared to the reference, but I don't know how big of a deal that is. I need to check in with myself to see if that's worth really adjusting, and I'm not sure it is. I don't know if it's going to have a significant impact on the composition or the recognition of the space. Although, as I'm thinking about it compositionally, I'm curious what happens if I just change this angle here, the way that hillside exits the page. So just kind of create a little bit more rhythm between those. See what that does. All right, so now I can switch to the tripod grip. In a few select areas, add some kind of finer marks that help to suggest focus and detail a little bit more. All right, so if as we near the end of the show, I just want to encourage everybody to share their work. Go to artistnetwork.com. You can find the link to the show page in the description below. I also pinned it to the top of the chat. I love seeing everybody's work. I saw some great parakeets that were posted last week. I don't know if anybody entered the Best in Show pet competition that we launched, but that's still open. If anybody's interested in participating in that. We've got quite a few competitions on Artist Network that are kind of fun to enter. I think I'm going to anchor this a little bit down to there by establishing that line there, and then maybe bring that forward a little bit. So these are all really minor kind of details that I'm contributing, kind of refining in just a few areas. And adding a few sharp marks can sometimes be enough to imply focus and refinement in a broader area. So I'm just kind of making a few marks, evaluating, and moving on. And this is where you as the artist are in control of how much texture you want to add, how far you want to refine the drawings, how much, where you need to add greater detail, things like that. Let's see. I'm just kind of almost thinking about it like a camera lens. I'm just sharpening up edges into certain areas. But okay. Monica's saying, have I ever done any drawings with H pens? I think I've only done really one pen drawing as part of the series. I do want to do more, so if anybody has recommendations for a set of pens that I should try out, pen and ink. Carolyn, I'm glad you liked this. Oh, and then Vidita saying, try to say the first form from the bottom at the left. Yeah, I need to figure out what I want to do there. I'm going to let that sit a little bit. Thank you, Susan. Oh, and they're saying it's a softer blue, how I can see it, not a hard tone. Yeah. Yeah, like on a larger scale, I see what you mean. It's like that value in this part is, I think some of that yellow is showing through here, and that's kind of throwing things off a little bit. And I see it as being lighter on that larger reference than what I'm seeing on the smaller one. Yeah, and actually at a larger scale, you can see so much variation in there that you really sink your teeth into. Now, what I'm seeing in the larger reference too is some more shadow structure along on this side here. So I've been really only utilizing this small thumbnail, and so now I have the larger one that can give you a little bit more detail. I can see these forms with greater accuracy. Go. I'm just adding a little bit more kind of refinement, just focusing on this area more than anything. But I don't know if it's going to make a huge impact on the drawing as a whole, so we'll see. And Monica, thank you for the comments, everybody. Oh, H pencils. Yeah, I do. Actually, did I use the H here? Yeah, I used the H really for most of the work back in this area. That's about as hard as I like to go, really. So, all right. Thank you, everybody. I think I'm going to call it about a day. I am curious, Dita. It's a really interesting comment talking about that blue shift. And we talked about color earlier. And utilizing the color of the paper here. I'm going to try something. Using this white charcoal. You see, it's just picking up the graphite. It's not really sticking, but I'm going to see if it helps to create that blue shift. It's not. I don't know if it's really doing anything. So just experimenting. This could ruin it altogether, but hey, that's what drawing's for, right? And that's why we're here to learn. So I'm just taking the sketch square lightly over it to intentionally mix it with the graphite to create that blue shift that Dita was talking about, and see if that helps with the overall drawing. Now, it certainly lightened it up, but perhaps that shift in temperature kind of replaces that shift in value in terms of defining that space. That's kind of an interesting look there. Tammy saying, keep picking stuff that looks so simple but is hard. Yeah, it's really tough. That happens all the time. I'm like, oh, I should be able to do this. And then it's a really hard subject. It turns out to be a lot. And in a lot of ways, the simpler the subject, what happens is then you have fewer elements in there. Each of those elements takes on greater importance, so you have to hit it more accurately, if that makes sense. Sometimes with a more complex scene, you can be off with those. The tolerance to variation can be greater because of that. So I don't know. What do you guys think of that? It's very subtle, but adding that white, I think it does create an interesting temperature shift. It creates that sense of atmosphere there, that kind of like bringing some of the atmosphere into that foreground. So it's almost looking like we have atmosphere over here, and it opens up with some clarity on this side, and then back into that atmosphere. All right, all right. So what is next? Oh, I don't know if I can grab it. There's a portrait. I'm going to be doing a portrait next. Actually, I posted it on artistnetwork.com. If you go to the Drawing Together page, you can see the episode for the next one. Actually, I think it's on YouTube already. I posted that as well. So it's a portrait that we're going to be working on next week. So we're shifting from landscape into portraiture. We had animals last week. Kind of doing a little bit of everything. We'll do a still life after that. More landscapes. All sorts of stuff. Oh, Nia's saying, please try the Winsor & Newton fine liner pens. And can we do a botanical drawing again soon? I'll see about a botanical one. I kind of selected some, but I didn't think about botanicals. So let me think about that. I think that's a good idea. All right, Heather, thank you. Let's see. I'm going to see what happens if I lay in a little bit more. I kind of forget that some of that white was really, really lost. So I'm going to lay down a little bit more here. And I think that helps to provide a little bit more contrast. So I think, I don't know, I'm kind of spent for the day. I feel exhausted. But this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for joining me today. Portrait next week. I can't wait to see all your drawings. I'm going to hang out for a few more questions from the group. But this is always my highlight of the week, is to draw with you all. So thank you all for joining me. I hope to see you again next week. Again, we meet every Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to draw together. If you are new and you want to go back through and see all the previous episodes, you can find them on artistnetwork.com on the Drawing Together homepage there, or just here on YouTube, where you can find the playlist that should have them all added there. So 118 episodes now. I can't believe it. Let's see. And Rocket 434 is sending now. Awesome. Yeah, and I'm going to try to, Nia, I'm going to try to get my hands on some of those fine liner pens, and I think I'd like to try out a pen and ink drawing. All right. Not seeing any additional questions. Thank you all so much for joining me. I'm going to sign off. Have a great week.